because live demos never work, we're deciding to try a live demo here. We're a part of our panel. So I decided to find an AI version of myself. So I actually used a generator to create an action figure of my idealized self. And he will be moderating part of the panel today. But we have a number of panelists, and I think you guys should each introduce yourselves. Start with Jason.
Hi, Jason Schugardt. I'm a solutions architect at NVIDIA. So I've been at NVIDIA just about a year. My previous life was a visual effects supervisor, working on set for commercials and feature films. That's my background for the past 25 years.
Hey, Greg Shiff. I am also a solutions architect. I'm global architect for M&E at Dell, so I cover sort of the whole Dell portfolio from storage to workstations to everything. I've been doing this gig for quite a while at Dell and other technology companies. My background, I was working in the broadcast space in New York for 10 years or so, and then realized I needed to get the heck out of New York City and moved up to Seattle. So that's me.
And you guys already all know me, Ashlee, workflow specialist here.
From 5 minutes ago, yes.
Yes.
And I'm Grandy. I'm also a solutions architect, also at NVIDIA. And my job is mainly to work with studios in the entertainment space and help you take advantage of new technologies, not just our GPUs, but also the SDKs, the microservices that we develop to help you bring your ideas to life. And so we wanted to bring this panel and kind of like merge a little bit of the artistic expression that we've been talking about and some of the technical details and how things break down. But what I want to start with were, what are some of the emerging technologies that you've seen around AI that could be utilized today that might be different from the Chat GPT and the Stable Diffusion that we've already heard about?
Sure, I can start there. So certainly we've spent a lot of time today talking about the creative tools, right? The generative AI and how powerful that is and a time saver. But actually one of the more interesting uses of AI with one of my studio customers was actually more on the administrative side. So what they were doing is they created a tool internally that was using AI. They could feed it, hey, we want to do a show or a movie, what have you. They feed it the script and a few other inputs, and then it comes back and says, hey, this is how long it's going to take. This is where you're going to, how much it's going to cost. These are the people you're going to need to hire. This is what it's going to look like. This is pre-production. This is what production is going to look like, and even post. And it allows them to make really good, educated guesses about this, much more so than a human, because there's a ton of inputs there. And it was kind of an interesting way of like, okay, these tools are useful in more than just making pretty pictures.
Yeah, I think a lot of customers are concerned about security too. There was a leak of data with Samsung a few months back where they put some data in there that got out to the internet. So a lot of customers are concerned and want to build an LLM that's a large language model that's on their own company's data, but is also internal facing, so they can expand it. There's several products out there. Nemo LLM from NVIDIA is one way you could do that, where you train a large model. It's been trained on a foundation, right? So it's as trained on all the English language, and then if you were to imagine an employee showing up for work at company Y, then you train that AI just on that set of data that understands what company Y's customers are, what their style is, what their extra data is that would make that LLM an employee, or that's special data for that context.
And I can bring it back a little bit to the art space, but we heard in the last discussion about the ability to also take voices and to generate them so that they are speaking in different languages, or so that they are speaking certain scripts for you. Super useful. I've actually used it on myself. It's great.
So we've heard a lot about the positives and why we should be utilizing AI. What are some of the limitations that we've seen now and that people are working to overcome?
I mean, I think that's been covered a bit in some of the other panels. We know, like, you can make tons of really bland images and really bland content if you don't know what you're doing, right? This is where I think this prompt engineer job title is super important, and we all need to become prompt engineers, I can speak to it. I'm a geek, so I play Dungeons and Dragons. And when this first came out, I was like, oh, I'm going to make a picture of my half-orc wizard Dungeons and Dragons character, and I discovered that I'm not a prompt engineer. It looked really bad.
Yeah, I think you get the assumption that anybody can do it, and that does elevate a lot of folks into playing with it. But I think in an artist's hands, like versus say, like my neighbor, right? Like an artist's hands will have an elevated aesthetic and understanding of composition and everything else that they will bring more to than my neighbor who is just in finance.
I think data is always has a huge potential to be very biased. On the image space, you see a lot of biased generations. If you ask for an artificial intelligence as a person, it's more likely to generate a female character, a female white character. And there's a lot of issues with that because it's trained on everything on the internet. And if training isn't done in a proper way or in a controlled way, you can end up with models that do some really weird things that are hard to control, and that can be very biased. And I think today they lack a lot of inclusion in other areas and other walks of life that just aren't readily available in our tech world or hemisphere. And so it'd be really interesting to see how models evolve to integrate other experiences and perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's actually a super interesting perspective, right? I think having curated training models for this stuff is going to become super important. You talked about a con. I think we're gonna have a wave of really bad content before we kind of figure this thing out, right? Like that's gonna come. It's gonna happen. It's already happened. You talk about models that do, not great things, right? I mean, I think there's been so many examples of that. My teenager was really excited about the infinite Seinfeld thing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It was super cool until it started spouting transphobic nonsense. And you're like, whoa, hold on, So I think that's a con for sure. But I think that's also a big opportunity. I mean, that's something that we see at Dell at creating, custom curated training models, right? Maybe having AIs curate your training model to train your AI. It goes round and round and round, but I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, they're finding some of the using the data from the larger language models, right, to train some of the smaller models like Junior or Lambda to be able to fit on smaller machines for large language models. So it's an interesting. There are lots of questions about where the data comes from, and so there's lawsuits in question about where, what that data has been trained on. So going back to that, you can build your own model on a very safe data set. For example, NVIDIA has partnered with Getty Images and Shutterstock to work with them to build a licensed model, on their data, right? So that way, the artists that are shooting those images are getting, residuals or getting payment for those types of images in their library.
Yeah, there are ways to do this in a safe and legal fashion and make sure that everyone who is has the rights to the imagery that are part of those data sets is properly compensated. And the part of it is going to the people who own that content, who have those rights. And so the ability to train these models, whether you're working with these foundational models, the idea is that you can start with you can go to Getty Images and you can work with them and say, okay, you have 10 million images that are a great start, but now I want you to understand the language of the films of, say, Martin Scorsese. And so you can take representative imagery from that and you can augment that model. You can do the fine tuning of that model, and you have a data set which you have the proper rights to be able to create that new content. So, and like we said, everything is all about the data. And so people talk about, the bias inside of AI, the bias is in the data. And so we also talk a lot about synthetic data generation. There are ways that you can generate the data that you don't have in order to make it more representational inside of your models. So we've talked a lot about ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion, but I'm wondering, what are some of the other technologies that you've seen, or even some of the vendors here today that you're excited about, some of the new ways that they're bringing this technology forward to allow artists and filmmakers to do something new and novel?
Yeah, Ashlee touched on it briefly. Obviously, 3D models are coming, and video is coming. Gen AI, Gen 2 is coming. So I think we're right around the corner from from seeing these models mature. Right now, I don't think it looks all that great, but I was saying that about last year about Midjourney and other generative art images. So I think it's not too far out. We're coming up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I'm struggling for like specific startup examples for this, but we're seeing data scientists get involved and building all kinds of really interesting things with some of these advanced math models and how all that's coming together. There was something we were talking about ahead of this. It was new FS, I think it was. What was it? No, I'm spacing on this now up on stage. But where it was generating these 3D models and beginning to be able to build these 3D worlds generatively. So I think that's super exciting for sure.
I think there's a lot of other really interesting tools too. There are AI tools that can help you go through large libraries of data. This can be super helpful if you've worked in a 3D production because there are so many assets and there are so many things to work with. And you can actually use AI to help you pull the assets you need, not only put them in a place that you can access them, but you can actually use AI to help you set dress and to quickly build out scenes or to quickly get your stuff into a project much more efficiently. And it can save you a lot of time because at least in the VFX world, when you're building out a shot, it does take a little bit of time to pull, let's say, your Alembic caches down and your proxy geometry, your regular geometry, getting your hair networks in there and actually compiling a scene together in order to generate it or to render it. Sorry, I'm getting confused between my terms. In order to render it and being able to actually use AI to kind of pull together that archive of data for you so you don't have to spend 30, 40 minutes finding everything, putting it all in a scene just so that you can actually start working with it. I think that's going to be huge too.
Yeah, I think a lot of customers are coming to us with problems where, say, you've been open for 30 years making images and taking photographs and having a stock library. But a library that big is useless if you can't actually find anything inside of there. So using natural language, right, you can now search those libraries. We have something called deep search that allows you to go through these libraries and look for a red rusty barrel, for example, and it'll find all of the, visually, it'll find all of those examples inside of your library, whether it's video or a 3D model, and make those libraries usable again.
So who's developing these tools? We know NVIDIA is developing these tools and the big players like AWS and Google and Facebook, but the artist tools that are finally coming to the forefront, like the stuff that we've seen today for the 2.5D virtual production, are those being done by larger companies? Or are they being done by small startups or kind of a combination?
I've
yes.
seen it. Yeah, yes.
The answer is yes, right? What I have seen with a lot of the folks that I work with, certainly in the bigger studios, is they're developing their own custom tools, right? There's a bit of an arms race there, whether it's their own game engines or other tools for you talked about classifying these large data sets. I mean, that's actually something at Dell that we're spending a lot of time thinking about and working on because we deal with everybody from M&E to banking and everything in between. So we deal with some of these very large data sets, and it's a big area of focus for us as to how to classify that, how to make that usable. Because if I have this, to your point, a 60-year archive of data, if I don't know what's there, then it's useless, right? So that's definitely a focus for us at Dell, actually.
Now, we talk about large language models. Most of the focus so far has been talked about how we can generate a script or how we can do summarization of something. What are some of the new areas that people are getting into where they're using large language models to take existing IP and make personalized content or interactive content?
Well, you could really imagine, I think it was touched on earlier, where you'd have personalized content from putting you in the story, right? Those are fairly easy, low-hanging fruit. But a large language model can also, there are many things you can apply a large language model to. So just going off on a little bit of the deep end here, there's already studies of taking MRIs and being able to decode your brainwaves into images, right? You take that one level out, and that's decoding your dreams and generating images. So if we're to say in the future whether how artists generate work, I think there's a lot of potential use cases where using LLMs to a lot of things wind up looking like languages or behaving like languages to an LLM.
I like it, Jason. I think startup idea, MRI to dream decoding to personalized content creation. Go.
We're looking for data scientists.
I've actually been experimenting with using a local large language model on my machine and actually using it to help me come up with ideas in the art space. So I can give it an image and I can say, hey, look at this image, make the helmet green, or give me different hat variations, or this character is going to go into this scene, he's got to pick up something, what is he picking up? And I can actually work kind of more constructively with it in a way that usually it's kind of a self-guided experience, and you can actually use a large language model to kick ideas around and it'll actually generate content for you. I don't know how to do it with anything other than images, but I could see in the future, a way for dentists to be like, hey, help me look for this issue in the teeth. There seems to be a root structural abnormality or something.
What I love about that is it is an assistant. It's like a perfect assistant where you're conversational and it's helping you get the next task done, right? It's along with you on the creative trail to explore and work and doing a lot of the mundane things. So I think as these LLMs mature and become better at multiple tasks and summarizing and being able to do a variety of different things, you would have an assistant along with you for the whole creative ride.
So Ashlee, I've got a question for you. When you're doing your work there, you talked about running these things on your machine. How much of what you're doing with this generative AI is running on your local machine with your local GPU, and how much of it is running in a cloud somewhere? And how do you think about that?
Okay, so here's the thing. If you're new to generative AI, the easiest way to start using it is to use a cloud service like Midjourney or DALL-E. You're going to be able to start and understand how to use it. But if you want to do a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, really those tools have been very community driven and they are mostly only locally available. So I spend the majority of the time doing most of my stuff on a local machine. And I generate hundreds of images, thousands of images a day. And I've actually run into issues where I needed to upgrade my hard drive space because I'm downloading multiple ControlNet models. I'm downloading like multiple language models, and all of a sudden I ran out of a terabyte of space and I still need to generate images. I actually spend most of my time on a local machine.
You guys like that leading question from the company that makes workstations?
Well,
and
I don't
graphics
care
cards.
either way. Yeah, but
no, but it's an interesting thing, right? This is a discussion, right, of what lives at the edge and what lives at the cloud. And I think for those of us in this space that work in the industry, we have limitless creative desires, and you have to think about how that relates to where my tools are going to live and what the cost implications are, of course. And what allows me to be most effective.
And it doesn't have to be a trade-off either. Like you guys saw with a lot of my workflows, I use a cloud-based service plus a local-based service all the time. Obviously, I spend more of my time locally because I have more tools available to me that are community-driven. And also, it's a lot easier. Like my images are already on my computer. I don't have to right-click and download them and log in and do all this stuff. They are there, and I just pull them into Photoshop, or I pull them into Fresco, or I doodle on them and I continue iterating on the process. So, it really depends on where you're at in your journey for generative AI and where you want to go. But, if you want to get the most out of that experience, a local machine that is able to handle it, honestly, it's the best bet because it allows you to actually be at that cutting edge and to actually use all of these tools to actually make some really cool art. So.
And I think when we talk about cloud, we're not necessarily limiting it to the big cloud providers. Like a lot of studios have their own localized clouds, and we're working on an edge network. And with the advantages, with a lot of these networks, is referred to as emergent abilities. So you can train a large language model with just a few parameters, and it'll understand English. And you can do simple question answer things. Like what time is it? And it'll tell you it's 506. But if you want something that's much more complicated, after it gets more and more data, it gets larger and larger, then it can start doing things like it can do translation. It can take what you've said in English and translate it into German or Japanese or another language where their language structure might be completely different to get the same meaning across. And you start looking at people are using large language models for code generation. So as you start getting to these emergent abilities, the large language models get so big that you really can't run them on one machine. So the idea of having an edge device or working with your studio and putting in their own custom cluster or working with one of the major cloud providers to host a custom cluster allows you to have a service that all of the employees can take advantage of, but is still custom and trained to your data set.
It's a rapidly developing technology, right? Like what lives locally, what lives in a cloud, whether that cloud is a hyperscaler or my own data center or some combination, and figuring out how to bridge the gap there. It seems like it's fairly segmented right now, right? Like you're either running it here or there. There's some overlap, but it's evolving.
Yeah, what I've been amazed at is the difference in the machines. Like Stable Diffusion has been running locally on the machine, but there's a whole community around updating that. So like the automatic 1111 webpage, and like the amount of tools, the speed that has been coming out has been incredible. And if you would compare that to a single company trying to pump this out, it's been a very different pace. It's so I think there's a lot of difference there.
I think casual observation here is that I feel like when a lot of these open source tools are available locally, we see an explosion in growth and in benefit, especially to creators, because basically you have access to the model. You have the ability to push it in ways that you wouldn't be able to sometimes if it were on a cloud, because you may not have access to it. And I think what's really interesting is it's kind of creating this symbiotic relationship where a lot of times locally, you're able to try these new things, those get implemented, and then they'll actually follow along onto the cloud, maybe in a later time, or maybe not. But I have made that observation where I've noticed that a lot of these open source tools that are community driven, they are rapidly developing. And a lot of that also comes with the fact that they are local so that anybody can use the model and make it do something that they needed to do.
Yeah, it's been incredible that even being able to train your own data sets, like opening that up, I think that is helping feed the direction of where these companies are building their tools into. So not quite there yet, but it's fascinating how that's worked together to help build those tools.
And I think there's also a broad set of tools which are not redefining the way production is working, but helping to make it easier and more attainable to different filmmakers. The idea of pose estimation without having to go to a motion capture studio and being able to use one or multiple cameras. We talk about like Move AI and being able to do it directly through a bunch of iPhones into the Unreal Engine and capture a character's motion. That also transcends onto larger sets where, well, maybe you want to be able to like do a quick rotoscope of someone, but you don't want to put them in a motion capture shoot because you want to actually capture them on set, but then you want to augment that footage later. So this gives you the kind of like the best of both worlds. Oh, I can actually have my primary actor on set in the natural lighting, but then I can do, augmentation of that by getting their skeleton, in an automated fashion. Or camera tracking is something that's been around for a long time, but now we have deep learning methods of doing automated camera tracking where it's much more accurate and much more usable on the first pass. We spoke at rotoscoping, I think is kind of the big key. No one likes to do rotoscoping. Rotoscoping happens all the time. But if you can train a neural network, and this is where it comes down to the studios who are like, well, like I'm Sony or I'm, Disney, and I've done 300 movies with rotoscoping. I've got all of this data that I can choose from. Like they're the prime candidates to be able to build their own network that would be able to, do rotoscoping much more efficiently. And then they could make that model available to all the productions internally, or even make it available as a microservice to external partners.
And when you combine rotoscoping with in-painting, you get backplates, generation. So there's all these tools that are coming out. Wonder Studios.
Wonder Studios is going to be having a great example of some of that technology. Kind of like all wrapped in a great package. Yeah.
So I'm curious what kinds of things NVIDIA is doing from like an API or SDK perspective for enabling some of these. Are you guys building hooks into some of these generative AI engines to be able to like better leverage your cores and all that? Let's go technical real quick. Talk. Let's go.
I think the big thing is people think of us as a video game company, and we really are. But on top of that, in order for those graphics to come to life, we work on a lot of low-level SDKs. The great thing about a low-level SDK is that software developers out there, like Epic with the Unreal Engine and Adobe and Autodesk and everyone else, can take advantage of them and make this new software. The problem is, if you're a smaller studio or you don't have those deep development resources, it's really hard to take advantage of it. So one of the things that we're doing more and more of is taking some of those low-level SDKs and making microservices out of them. That little avatar toy I was showing you is something that we refer to as Live Portrait. And we're making that available coming up as a microservice that you could run. So if you did want to be an avatar during a live broadcast, that's something that you could do, and you don't need to learn how to program that into your own application or implement it into Premiere or whatever. You'll be able to run it as a microservice, and it basically shows up as like, I have my webcam and I have this virtual webcam. This virtual webcam happens to be the Mona Lisa that's talking. So we're getting to more and more things like that, like kind of the idea of like bringing some of our lower level technology as microservices, but then also working with more and more of our partners. We're only developing things that are going to be useful. So we want to hear more from the customers out there about what problems you're trying to solve, because some of the stuff that we do is like really awesome and really sexy, and a lot of it is not. And sometimes the stuff like automated budgeting is something that could really save a production. One of the big things that we've seen over the years is,
I think automated budgeting is pretty sexy myself.
It is pretty awesome, but there was a disconnect between production and post-production. And a lot of times a small change in production could drastically help post-production and bring that budget down. But everyone's protective of their own budget. They're not thinking of things holistically. And I'm hoping with these tools where people are now, with virtual production, they're thinking about the design and the integration up front. And so they're thinking about the budgets throughout the whole process and not just these segmented little things. And I think AI can help look at that and see if there's an imbalance in what you're doing. I don't know, Jason?
Yeah, you touched on virtual production. I think like a lot of these tools are changing the way that people are working, right? So just shifting into that a little bit, I think there's a lot of new workflows that are coming through, not just on video, but also the way that we shoot, like in production. So let's say virtual production's been very hot this year. There's a new technology called NeRFs, right? So NeRFs are a volumetric format that you can capture something photographically. This has got a huge potential for being able to shoot a location out and not have to get a permit, or if you're going to shoot 9 locations in one day, you don't have to travel out to those different spaces. This is a place where you can shoot a volumetric neurographic primitive and represent that on an LED wall and move a camera around within that space.
If you don't know what a NeRF is, that's the one thing that you should check out after this when you get home tonight, because I think it's going to revolutionize how virtual production happens. The difference is right now with photogrammetry is you go in and you take a whole bunch of photographs of something, and then you hit the button, and hopefully it creates a geometry, a model that you can do something with, and it creates textures. The problem is it has all the lighting baked in from one point of view or different points of view. And so you have to go in and you have to rebuild that geometry to do something with it. And you've got to rebuild those textures to do something with it. So it's not really an automated process yet. With a NeRF, it's what we refer to as being view dependent. So if my camera is here, I see one thing. If I see it from over here, I see something else. The lighting is different. The specular reflections are all different. And with it being view dependent, I can go in and I can capture everything about an environment, and then as I change my camera in the virtual environment, I get those updated reflections from that new point of view without having to rebuild everything from scratch by hand. So we think that's going to be something that's going to come to the forefront on virtual production stages, and allowing you to send a camera crew to the location that you want, capture that environment, and then bring it back to the stage.
Yeah, we're already seeing that in self-driving cars. We're also using that as a format. I've seen Google use that as a form of street view where you can fly through. They announced this on their last announcements, where you can fly through a restaurant, and it's viewed as a nerf. So anywhere you want to go inside this place, and you see all the reflections and objects are transparent as they should be, right? So glassware, if you were to try and solve that as a polygon, it would just turn into a mushy blob, but it represents correctly inside of the nerf.
That was the thing I couldn't think of before, was the nerf. I was like, it's in something. It's super amazing. You definitely check that out. But to go back to something you said before, Rick, about, just making it work, right? You said, hey, if I'm a giant studio with, quote unquote limitless budget, it can play with science experiments, but a lot of what you do is making sure that it's easy and it just kind of works. And that's actually gets to a little bit of the partnership between Dell and NVIDIA, right? That's a lot of what I do working with these guys, is to just make sure that it just works, right? Which is not always as easy as it ought to be, as I have seen, right?
Yeah, it's like everything has to work together. You need the software needs to work on the components. The components need to come together in a full system, but the system has to be orchestrated. We also have this problem of you've got a massive amount of data that you're doing when you're training these models or doing these things, and just something like networking. Like if your computer's only working at like 30%, capacity because the network is slow, you're losing money. So when people are looking at outfitting to be able to take advantage of this stuff, we think you got to think of it holistically. Like look at the entire data center, look at the way that you're going to do things, and even that could determine whether or not you're looking for a complete infrastructure overhaul, or whether you're looking to partner with a cloud provider. So we try to tell people compute where your data is.
Yeah, it's a really good year for upgrades. I think there's all the planets have aligned this year with PCI Gen 5. There's a new card that's on the NVIDIA side that's twice the speed as last year. That doesn't happen every year. So there's several things that have that are working perfectly. What can you say about that?
More and faster
side?
and better. Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to turn this into a Dell sales pitch, but to get a little bit more about what I do, right? I run a media lab in Seattle, and I have a variety of workstations and storage and networking and NVIDIA GPUs. And actually, so I've been in this role about 4 years, and previous to this, I was a little bit more specialized. And it was shocking to me when I all of a sudden got the keys to this lab and started putting things together, how frequently it didn't work right. to your point, if the network's only running at some percentage and you're losing money. And it was just revelatory to me as I've gotten more deeper into building these solutions, as to how often it doesn't work. I guess that's why a lot of us have jobs here, but
So hoping we can open up for questions. We got a few minutes, because we would really like to hear what your big problems are, or
what do you want from Dell and NVIDIA?
Some free stuff. Oops.
Me too.
So in terms of, we have human rights, we have data rights. What about AI rights? What are your thoughts on how AI is going to be rights with the people that's actually putting in the prompts? Just anything that you could speak on that as we start creating with AI.
I think it's tricky, right? So in an earlier iteration of this panel, we went down an ethics rabbit hole, and then we were like, no, we're not going to be the ethics on AI panel. But I'm happy to talk ethics. I think it's super interesting. I think it's something we need legislation around, to be honest with you. I mean, we as humans live around alien intelligences all the time, right? All these intelligent animals, that are all around us, corvids and all the rest, and we don't treat them really well. So I can imagine with a computer, I don't know.
Some of the big relationships we have, the legal ramifications of things are usually what stall things from proceeding at the speed of light. And a lot of it comes down to, we have technology where we've designed this amazing model, and it doesn't do anything without data. We don't own any data. We don't shoot any pictures. We have Ashlee and a small team of artists, but we don't have millions of artists. So we need to spend our time working with someone. If we have the model and you have the data, then who's the ownership? It's basically co-ownership. Then what are we going to do with it? So make it a microservice available to the world. That's what we're doing with our foundational models. So you look at again, our work with Getty Images and Shutterstock, is taking that. Like they have the models, or they have the data. We have the researchers and the models, and we're working together, collaborating, and they're bringing it to market. It's their service. It's going to be a Getty service, and we're just the compute platform underneath it. So
I will tell you that the EU just rolled out a new AI set of rules that
Yes.
assigns 4 tiers of risks, and there's a lot of concern that that will go the same direction that the GDRP went, which is not only be about Europe, but everyone will look to that as a standard, and it's pretty intense. So we have a question right here.
Oh, so I wanted to ask about that demo that was up there earlier. Was that a real-time stable diffusion generation driven by your face?
yeah, so we have an SDK called Live Portrait, and it's part of we have this broader collection of Maxine called Maxine, and it's a bunch of video effects. So you've probably seen we have like audio filters that remove noise, or automatic like green screen removal type of things, regardless if you have the green screen or not. Live Portrait is a new capability that's coming out, and so if you take an image that is humanoid, it can animate it in real time with your face, or you can run it in an offline capacity and get a slightly higher quality version.
There's a phone app called Elbow.ai that has a similar functionality that you can try today.
Yeah.
Over here, Emmy winner Paul DeBever.
Hi there. Great panel. So like a point of clarification on NeRFs, as radiance fields, they're not fundamentally relightable. They do have view-dependent reflections, but but the lighting stays the same in the scene. You're just moving them around and seeing the reflection. It's an active area of research to try to find ways of turning radiance fields into things like reflectance fields and material properties so that you can relight them. But the question I wanted to ask is that graphics cards, like fundamentally when they first started coming out, were hardware accelerated texture map
Raster
polygon
engines,
scan
yeah.
conversion. And so the kinds of models that come out of photogrammetry, there's been hardware around for 20 years to render photogrammetry models like really effectively. What kinds of things are being thought of at NVIDIA for hardware accelerating these new neural kinds of rendering structures so that we can make just as good use of them as we've done with everything else?
Yeah, the nice thing about the NeRFs is we can take advantage of our tensor cores. So the tensor cores that are utilized for the mathematical calculations for most AI, we can utilize those. But also you can ray trace a NeRF, which is great. So a lot of times that we think of it as computational photography, but on this new paradigm. And yeah, there's a lot of work, looking at, how can we refit, a NeRF into your use case. Right now, the nice thing about it is you don't need quite as many hundreds of photos to generate a really good NeRF as you do for photogrammetry. And our thought is you have these amazing, gaffers and lighters and set, decorators on set. You just capture the images of the different lighting situations that you want, with those amazing artists, and then you're going to reproduce those later. And then I think as the technology comes online to be able to relight NeRFs, but we also tell people, there are two ways that you can look at a NeRF. Most NeRF examples out there are of an object. And a single object is usually what you want to relight. But the environment around you, generally, you're not relighting and changing. That's going to affect the lighting of the actors and the things that are in the scene. So in that use case, virtual production is kind of like the perfect use case for where the technology for NeRFs is now. You can capture multiple situations. You can put it on your wall, and chances are those are going to affect the lighting of 3D objects and things within your scene without having to manipulate those directly.
Yeah, right now NeRFs are more about static scenes. I think that's more readily available, but there's already papers out there that are starting to show animated NeRFs and being able to do sequences where you can see leaves blowing. And
there's a data set that just came out, they call Human RF, which is all animated NeRFs of people. So
does anybody remember when NeRFs were things you shot out of a gun? Just kidding. All right, another question over here.
My name is Alexander McDaniel, and I have a question for all the panelists. How is web GPU, if not at all, going to be incorporated into your companies? And I don't know if you covered this or not because I had to step out for a second, but I just want to hear your guys' opinions on this, what is happening for the future, and just want some insight.
I didn't catch part of it. How much what GPU?
Web GPU?
Web GPU.
Oh, web GPU. like WebGL versus remote compute and pixel streaming?
I'm not that. I'm 15, so I'm not that like technological.
Well, we can cover a few things. I think the great thing is like you don't necessarily need to have a high-powered machine under your desks. Someone else can have that high-powered machine, and you can stream the pixels, to that end, to the end user. So essentially, you have like I can have a low-powered laptop. Dell was actually gracious to give me a very high-powered laptop to be able to run this live portrait demo. But you can have a low-powered laptop that connects into your main data server. And stream the pixels. So they're actually doing all of the rendering of the graphics and everything in real time and streaming it to you. The cool thing is if you're working on a particular production, you don't have to download anything to your local machine to work on it. It's already there. So the computer is there, the storage of the data is there, and you're working on it there.
Yeah, I think WebGPU was just announced at Google just recently, right? I think that's where it's coming from. So it's about. I don't think there's been a whole lot of updates since OpenGL. So this gives it websites an exciting new boost in graphics performance. That's where it's coming from. But to what Rick was speaking to, I think where we're seeing a lot of excitement is being able to host a 4 graphics card, Omniverse experience or something along those lines in a cloud, and then streaming that to your tablet, right, or to a headset, right? Something like a Quest. That's being able to take one of the most expensive graphics cards on the market and be able to shove it into a small thing. You'd never be able to do that on with a Quest. It'd be too hot and heavy. So that's where I'm seeing a lot of excitement.
One of the more interesting little startups I talked to at NAB in Vegas about a month ago was a company that was playing around with being able to basically take GPUs that are living in one computer and then share those over the network to my other machine and treat them like local GPUs, right? So maybe I'm not familiar with WebGPU at all, but it sounds like a kind of similar thing, right? So to Ashlee's point earlier about running workloads locally, well, if you can then extend that GPU power to GPUs that are remote, I don't know, cool things coming.
A few more questions?
Hi. My name is David Altanel. A part of managing a pretty large visual effects house. I'm wondering about implementation strategy. There's so many players, things are changing so quickly. You talked about the sexiness of AI for budgeting. We're interested in that resource management as well as all the image generation, whether it's 3D modeling and NERF implementation. And there's so many components. If you guys have advice on the best way to track the market, figure out if there's separate tools that apply.
Much.
Adaptation,
right?
I don't know. There's an adaptation threshold there. In 25 years of the industry, I remember the first adopters were spending. The very first machine I worked on was $400,000. But as a tape op, I was using it, just to move files around. Only 3 or 4 years later, so you could see, the evolution. Like say in the early 2000s, the VFX companies were buying $1 million flame units, and that was all behind glass. Now, a couple years later, that was turned into a Linux box and for a quarter of the price. So you start to see when do you buy in? And I can see there's also an issue of you want to invest in that technology. At what point do you actually buy and you can hold on to it for a period of time? That I don't know. That's a hard time to guess.
I was gonna say, understanding where you are in the development chain. Not everyone has a team of developers that can take advantage of a low-level SDK. But you might have an idea, and there might not be something in the market that does that. And so you can work with all these. There are solution providers out there that from Quantified, SoftServe, and they're developers basically who will write code for hire. So the idea is if you have an idea and there isn't something that's out there, the first thing we always tell people, well, if someone has got a tool that is going to do the job for you, it's probably way less expensive to actually utilize that tool because it's aggregated amongst all the other users. But if that doesn't exist, it's a good time to partner up with these developers and have them what, I have an idea for this tool that I think is going to be really big for the way that audio engineers are going to be dealing with multiple language dubs. And you could run with it. So we see people kind of hitting us all across the spectrum, and we refer them out to professional services organizations or whatever. But kind of knowing where you are and what your capacity for that development is, I think, is a good place to start.
And this is maybe answering a little bit of a different question than you asked, but it's there's a lot of FUD out in the world. There are a lot of people, new tools that say they do X, Y, Z. I think tracking like real referenceable architectures from big technology companies like Dell and NVIDIA to see, hey, did they really do this? Did they test it? Did they write it up in the lab? Is there a paper? I mean, that's a big part of what I do is write white papers and build things out and make sure they actually work so that when they break, they pull me in front of the customer and they're like, this isn't working. I'm like, hey, it worked in the lab. But I think that's important when we're looking at these new tools, especially to make sure that they've been vetted and validated by the providers you're going to run it on, basically.
One more over here.
Hi, we've seen a lot of this develop really fast, like these visual large language models. I guess I'm wondering if you guys were to predict, do you think we'll continue to see this rate of growth? Do you think it'll slow down? Where do you guys see this going?
I mean, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right? Like VR was going to be huge in the 90s, and then, well, that didn't really happen. And then it was going to be huge about 5 years ago, and that hasn't happened, and we'll see. Is AI going to be the same? I don't think so, but I don't know.
I think people need to find actual use cases and put it into production. When it's just a novelty, then it could fizzle out. But we're seeing like large language models being put to actual work. And we're seeing people utilize, some of the image generation tools again for actual work. And as that continues, then the development will continue. But
if I were to personally speculate, I don't think it's going to slow down. These AI models, they're rapidly learning. They're doing things that no one predicted they would be able to do at this point in their development stage. And they are incredibly useful. Like he said, they're not just novelties. People can actually apply them to real world problems and pain points and use cases. So I don't think we're going to see a slowdown in the rapid development, but I think we're going to start to see people unifying it and trying to make sense of it. Because right now it's kind of like a bag of chaos marbles, and you just kind of jingle around the chaos marbles and you're like, what's going on? I think we're going to start to see a little bit more knowledge come out and a little bit more structure come out of it, but I don't think it's going to slow down.
Yeah, I think the big thing is these really large models that are somewhat unwieldy. There's a lot of work on how we can optimize them to the point where you can use them on a mobile device, without having to call a microservice. So there'll be various levels. So there's the idea of models creating new data sets to train more targeted models. So we're going to see a lot of that, I think, coming up.
Great. Before we wrap out this session, I just want to let everyone know if you leave the campus after 6, they're telling me you're not going to be let back in, and that's party time. So I would definitely stick around. Would you guys like to wrap us out? Give us an idea about where all these fine folks can get resources about all the great things that you just shared.
Go to NVIDIA.com.
Dell.com.
Yeah. We actually do have a developer site. So you go to developer.nvidia.com, and in there you'll see some of the cool AI tech that we're working on, and some of this stuff is in, we refer to as early access. So like our ACE microservice will allow you to do not just the live portrait that we demonstrated, but also do full 3D animation of lip sync and facial animation through just audio. And that will be available as a microservice. So the cool thing is if you're trying to do a scratch track or you've animated something and now you want to take, because it's language independent, you've done all this amazing animation and now you want to make it available in German, in Japanese, and in French. You'll be able to do that through running it through. There's still in beta phase, but these things are coming. So the idea is we want to have more of a global deployment of our IP.
Anything else from you, Greg?
No, I'm good. Thanks for having me.